Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here this morning with you folks to share with you some activities and projects I've been involved with over the past few years, trying to identify possible ways in which tea might fit into a small farm setting in California. So I'll spend a few minutes giving you a little background about the small farm setting in California and how we think that tea might be a part of that, and some of the principal concerns and limitations in small farm agriculture in California, some of the possible design concepts that we might use to fit tea into a small farm setting. I think in this particular case with tea, there's a lot of special ways in which growers have to become versed in the different aspects of not just growing, but also processing and marketing tea effectively, because the overall success of tea, I think, in the small farm setting is going to depend on really being involved in all of these different aspects. And then I'll end by explaining to you more or less where we are. I think one of the principal challenges, and I usually tell new small farmers in California who call me with interest in what crop they should grow and how to be successful on a small farm, is that growing is the easy part, that they really need to start from the very beginning to think about marketing, and that they should plan on more than 50% of their time being involved in marketing the crop. Growing is relatively easy. And then, of course, more recently, we've had things come up that have dramatically affected all farming in California, not least of which is labor availability and labor supply and mobility and cost and so forth. There are many possible alternative crops for small farmers, but we need to almost review potential new crops as from a marketing standpoint backwards. The new grower or even an established small farm grower who plans to diversify into a new crop needs to be thinking about where they're going to sell the crop almost before they plant. And invariably we have the quandary of, if we have a new product, we're uncertain about a market for that new product, and so growers are hesitant to plant or hesitant to spend a lot of money in a crop that doesn't have a proven market, and usually you don't have a proven market if you don't have the crop available. So the two kind of have to grow simultaneously, and that usually involves a learning process and obviously a period of time and an expense for someone, usually the farmer. So when we start thinking about a new crop, we really then have to identify a way in which this crop can become a small farm business model, because for small farms to be sustainable in California, they have to eventually provide a return for the grower. And there can be limitations of various kinds. I mentioned labor as a possible limitation, identifying market potential when there is no product available, essentially. There may be food-related permitting requirements, as we find with many crops in California, where additional processing is required. And then, of course, any new crop requires startup costs, and that is related to the time frame involved in developing the new crop activity. So we need to be, as we take apart tea as a potential niche crop for small farms in California, we need to be thinking about how the grower ends up developing an income stream or a potential for a profitable. It's not like the bulk of the rest of world tea production that may be marketed on a fairly large scale and to large, broad, diverse markets, but it's more likely to be a niche crop with very specialized income streams. So tea is a potential new crop in California because we have nice long growing season and in large parts of California, mild growing season. We also have an extremely diverse population in California, not just of native or not people who live here, residents, but also visitors and a very diverse tourist base. And then, of course, this large, diverse tourism base is, of course, seeking out wineries and wine tasting options and many other types of diverse tourist activities in California. And other types of agritourism are becoming more and more popular, picking berries and in addition to wine tasting. And so I think many people feel that tea could be part of this regime and that there is enough worldwide appreciation now for tea culture, tea processes, tea tasting, tea ceremonies to develop tea as an alternative agritourism crop. So we need to really look at and kind of take tea apart, and it's not just the rich diversity of types of teas, but the processes involved in developing teas and processing and developing tea products, and then of course alternatives beyond the different types of processing activities. There are also many cultural aspects, different 2 or 3 dozen different cultures around the world consume tea in one or another way and have unique and special modifications of it. So there is a base. Camellias are widely grown and appreciated in California, the Camellia genus, and tea grows well here in many settings in California with relatively modest modification. And so we take advantage of this growing appreciation worldwide for tea and tea products and see how we can make all of that into the kind of product and niche crop that could potentially be profitable on small farms. So we have an array, a fairly wide array of potential options for incorporating tea and tea products into the small farm setting, but we need to identify more carefully how exactly that will work, and each grower, of course, has to take into account how that fits with their lifestyle, their farm setting, and their other cropping regime. So fortunately, our subtropical conditions contribute to attractive growing conditions for tea. We do need to make some modifications because much of the tea in the world is grown at high elevation tropical and subtropical conditions with relatively high rainfall, quite different soils, different water quality. These are not differences that we're unfamiliar with in California, and we routinely have to make these kinds of changes and these kinds of adaptations when we adapt any new crop. So we have to incorporate experiences that we've had with other types, very similar crops, and see in which ways we might modify those to grow tea. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier that in some cases we will require some for more extensive tea servicing and tea serving situations and setting up tea tastings and tea ceremonial rooms. You may need special permitting requirements that are currently given a complete pass for the wine industry, but most other items that are produced in a small farm setting and have to be served to the public have permitting and health department requirements. So then we will take tea and we'll adjust planting design. We have tea established on several farms now, and a growing number of farms are looking at ways and how that might fit into their specific growing conditions. And then, of course, we have to begin to think about how that might fit into the small farm setting, whether we're growing it as traditional tea rows or in tea clumping in a more naturalized setting. We have to be thinking about harvesting, whether or not we're going to be setting up. In some cases, I think there's a good case to be made for you pick, you process tea, where part of the whole experience of visiting the farming operation and getting to know tea in a small farm setting would be picking and learning to process small batches of tea. But if you aren't doing that, you're going to have to be harvesting. There are, fortunately, small-scale mechanized equipment set up for using small amounts of labor to harvest small batches of tea in a small farm setting. So management is really the key for success in growing the tea crop, and there's a lot of well-established experience with growing teas in different environmental conditions. And then, of course, we need to be modifying, in some cases, the soil and waters that we're working with. Many soils and water supplies, irrigation water supplies in California are neutral or above 7 in pH, and tea may require a pH in more acid conditions, both of the soil and the water. But these kinds of things can be done and are done routinely in California cropping systems currently. I think it's not unreasonable to expect from experience that we've had with the tea planting thus far, and with camellias generally, that we can expect probably 6 to 10 flushes of tea, depending on the site and specific location and the management per year. So there is the potential for a very long season of harvesting and processing. So we need to be thinking then about how we can adapt, depending on the individual small farm setting, adapt tea to an individual grower's lifestyle and that farm setting and the tourism base or other potential client base that might be there, and whether or not you're going to be providing tea gardens where visitors can experience tea growing in different natural settings and cultivated settings, and then harvesting small batches of tea and learning about the processes of processing tea. Then eventually, depending on the setting, experiencing tea ceremonies, tea tastings, and even buying tea that has either been processed there or brought in. So part of all of this, I mean, a fundamental part of all of this is further development and refinement and expansion of the overall tea appreciation that's taking place in the US and globally. So I think the key thing is that the tea processing requirements for different types of tea provide for us opportunities to incorporate this into the small farm setting in different cases, and points of interest for potential visitors and for the public. We're starting in most cases with the same plant species, as most of you know, and it's just a matter of adapting this to different processing techniques and then creating different possible products according to different possible routes. So all of this really creates the circumstances for unique opportunities for each small farm setting, if we look at it this way, and based on the client base and the practices and experiences of the individual grower, they can adapt this to their specific circumstances. But there's a huge array with tea of potential on-farm activities and on-farm options for clients and visitors. So we're really taking advantage of the fact that there are so many different ways that tea travels from the tip of the plant to the cup, that we then adapt each of these to specific farm conditions and turn them into the potential for learning experiences and activities in the agritourism setting on small farms. So we take these individual steps. At each step, we have different processes and different potential products and different attractive attributes that can be incorporated depending on the activities of the grower and the experience of the grower in the specific small farm setting. And in the large majority of cases, we're going to be dealing with very small batches of tea and finding ways in which we can educate visitors and client buyers of our tea products in the different aspects of the tea process. And then, of course, tea taste comparisons, fanatical tea gourmet visitors can certainly take advantage of different types of teas, known varieties in some cases, but grown in a very different setting and perhaps processed, and different environmental conditions, of course. And then, of course, there's a wide array of tea ceremonies and serving that come from a diverse array of cultures from around the world that can be incorporated into specific small farm settings. So we're basically taking advantage of the fact that there are tea rooms in many major cities now, and quite common in tea ceremonies and tea servings and tea tastings, but they're extremely rare on California farms. There are a few in other farms in the US and in other parts of the world, but they're very rare in California. And all of this can eventually be turned into demonstrations and various types of processes and demonstrations that the visitors would be interested in. So we're essentially, I think, trying to create a tea room atmosphere, more or less, in a small farm tea garden setting. We have lots of different ways we can make these very simple with landscaping and fairly simple primitive deck structures, and then increasingly complex structures, some of which are sold now by home improvement centers as home studios or home workshops. And so there's a wider range of these that you can almost buy already set up for you, but you can certainly adapt them to your specific circumstances and needs. And so conceivably, each of these types of structures can be used as a structure where you're doing part of the processing operation. You're doing either the wilting or the heating or the rolling, and maintaining all of this within the landscape and tea room and tea garden setting that would be so desirable. So there's lots of options available, and all of these can be adapted to your specific circumstances. But of course, all of these require time and investment, and everyone is hesitant, as with any new crop. I was telling one of my colleagues earlier that if we were going to plant lettuce or radishes, we would be having to be doing this similar kinds of planning and similar kinds of investment with an uncertain market. So you need to be thinking from the very beginning about the flow of product into the market stream. I just want to summarize for you kind of where we are at this point. I've been meeting with a couple of dozen different growers over the past couple of years, and from the coast of California, really all the way from northern Los Angeles County to San Luis Obispo County. We have a couple of tea farms planted now, and a couple that are making plans to plant, preparing land, and waiting for the transplants to be ready later in the spring. So we also have identified new promising sources of tea germplasm. There's not a large amount of tea germplasm available in the United States of currently produced and widely produced varieties, and then much of the germplasm that's utilized in China or India or Japan is produced from clones, and we in large part have primarily seed sources available. So there is going to be a period of time during which what I would describe as enriching our germplasm base is going to be a key activity for those of us involved in doing research and development kinds of work with tea. And we're doing that now. That's underway. So we also have then come up with some of these kinds of design possibilities for small farms, and I've walked through several farms now with growers, exploring with them different options for establishing tea in their specific setting. We've had several educational meetings for groups of growers looking at tea 101 to processing small batches of tea and sources of tea, germplasm, and so forth, making growers, because in large part, growers were completely uninformed about tea, or were more interested in tea, but had less experience in agriculture. So we've kind of got people from both ends drifting toward tea agritourism now in California. So we're basically trying to establish several different multiple components to what would eventually be a technical support base for a nascent tea industry in California that would consist of these germplasm availability, research and development, educational, the development of educational programs that would be important and useful, and those kinds of activities then would help support and provide a research and development base for further expansion of tea plantings. So we, as part of our identification of germplasm, have been able to identify seed sources and import promising germplasm either as clonal cuttings from collections in Hawaii or from seed from commercial sources in China. And then as a result of this too, we now internally within the UC system have several projects being initiated to plant tea gardens and compare tea growing and tea variety production in different growing settings in California with tea gardens that will be fairly long duration, really, because we can hardly learn much at all about tea in less than 10 years by the time you get a new planting established and begin to sample off of that and obtain research results. Okay, I hope that I've given you a basis then for kind of understanding how tea might fit in a small farm setting. I think that we do have some potential for tea in California. I think we have potential for incorporating tea into the small farm setting as a niche crop, and there's enough variability in different processing and cultural aspects and ceremonial aspects of tea appreciation that these farms will complement each other in large part. And I think a network of small farms in California would be in itself self-supporting and would help complement each other in different educational and marketing aspects. Are there questions? Do I have time for questions?
I have a question.
So we do have a little bit of time for questions reserved at the end, but we can also take in a couple of questions now. So
good. Just tell me when. Yes.
Hi. Just wondering with regard to cultivar suitability, if any of the germplasm that you've looked at so far, what cultivars from which regions elsewhere in the world are starting to look promising for California suitability?
Well, so far we have identified seed sources primarily from China, and then there is a collection at the USDA station in Hilo, Hawaii, that is now managed by the University of Hawaii. They have now provided clonal cuttings of 4 or 5 different varieties. I think a couple came from Japan originally, maybe 1 or 2 from India, 1 from Taiwan, or 2 from Taiwan. So for those of you who didn't hear, I think the question had to do with what geographic settings we have obtained germplasm thus far. Is that true?
And the suitability. Can you please come to the microphone?
So the question was generally speaking about the suitability of the cultivars you've looked at so far with regard to the ability to grow it in California and its success rate.
Yeah, these are brand new, and I don't foresee problems. We have other tea cultivars from Southern California, from nurseries, camellia nurseries, that have been growing tea for, in some cases, 50 years, 60 years, and have selected their own tea cuttings. And some of those are available for growers to plant also. In fact, I've been recommending to growers because the new sources of germplasm, of course, are very young. The plants tea plants grow very slowly in the beginning from seed, so it might well be that a new planting, and thus far most of the new plantings have used established plants from established nurseries in California, and then we're filling in with these so we can begin to establish these new seed varieties in different settings, on farm settings and also on some of the California research farms. I don't have any reason to think that they will be markedly different from the others, but.
As far as cultivars go and processing of different types of tea, in general, the different types of tea, are they all from single unique types of cultivars, or so if there's a collection of California tea farms, would they be able to, with cooperation, like, some people make, green, some people make white with the same cultivars, or once you start planting one, you only can process it in one way?
Well, some of the cultivars that we have, for example, have traditionally been grown in Chinese production areas as either oolong or green or white tea, but they can be processed as any kind of tea if you wish. It may well be that they have characteristics that make them more, I would expect they would have been selected for those types of tea, but in a small farm setting with a much larger public who's really learning about tea, it may not be that important initially. Now, I suspect tea connoisseurs are going to want to taste Longjing or Dragonwell tea in one setting and then compare it in another setting and compare it to what they have experienced from China. And that should hopefully be part of the unique experience that we're offering and small farms are offering and can take advantage of.
And how many cultivars are there?
Well, I'm aware of nurseries in the United States that might have a half dozen or between a half dozen and a dozen where you can order in. There's a nursery in Southern California that has 2 tea cultivars, and they have selected themselves, and they have been propagating other camellias, ornamental camellias, and tea for many years, and have selected these and propagated them as clones. And then we have 3 seed selections that we've brought in. I think there are 5 total from the University of Hawaii. But none of these are available currently. That's the other issue, is once you have the material here and you start propagating it, it takes a while before you get enough volume in the stream to where someone can sell it commercially. We're kind of doing all of that simultaneously at this point.
And it sounds like the higher altitude cultivars are not here at all.
Well, we have some from China that are, and the ones from Hawaii are as well. And in some cases, some of the similar varieties, I know Yabukita is a widely grown variety in Japan, and that's one of the varieties from the University of Hawaii. And I know we have a Dragonwell tea from China and another oolong tea from China. The tea from the nursery in Altadena is also an oolong tea, or has been grown as an oolong tea here. I think some of the grower experience from this afternoon may clear up some of those questions.
Just one. So yeah, you're talking about the coast. It grows people have done it mostly on the coast of California, but like, the whole Sierra Nevadas where it's much colder, that would be another type of cultivar than.
We just don't know. I mean, part of our interest now is getting an entire set of the same cultivars at several different locations in California and looking at the tea quality coming off of those. We're in the process of doing that. That's part of our plan.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for now, so we can go ahead and come back after the 2 other presenters have made the presentation. Thank you very much, Mark. Yes.